um, just read from the, and I hope it will all just make sense. So I'm pretty much dealing with two concepts really, but the one concept that I have a bit more intimate relationship with is the term bureaucratization. And the other term which I'm going to be referring to towards the end is decolonization. Now, part of the reason why I'm not sort of making a disclaimer about decolonization is because there's two broad movements that have been at the forefront of the decolonization movement in South African universities in particular. And that has been the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the Fees Must Fall movement. Now, I'm not, even though I'm a student, I'm not intimately involved with those movements. So I really can't speak as an authority or even as a participant. But what I can say is that it does seem to provide certain answers, even though those answers might not be ideal in terms of what a future dispensation might look like. And certainly there's a lot of contestation in South Africa right now about whether or not these movements are progressive or reactionary, and even but I'm behind those movements, and it will become clear hopefully as to why I am. Okay. But let me start by paraphrasing Achille Mbembe, who in the Post-Colony writes something along the lines of the formation of this post-colonial state has got to do with questions of who gets what, under what circumstances, under which rules, through which mechanisms, and to what end. And I would also add that the issues of ethical, moral, and intellectual arguments that are made to buttress claims to power are also important. And so as far as I've observed since post-1994 scenario, let me just make a slight digression there. You will keep hearing me talking about post-1994 instead of post-apartheid. And the distinction there is that while we acknowledge that there was a certain turn in 1994 with the new democratic dispensation, it does not necessarily mean that apartheid ended. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's why I tend to avoid the term post-apartheid. Although I will be using it in a rhetorical fashion. Okay. So as far as I've observed, in the case of the post-1994 scenario in South Africa, heritage and heritage professionals have been enlisted to the service of post-apartheid nation-building narrative. The grand narrative focuses on certain individual sites, stories in order to provide, and not necessarily in a cynical matter, the grounds on which moral right to rule is founded. The ruling National African National Congress, or ANC, has an undisputed command over the national government, 8 out of 9 provincial governments, and the majority of municipalities. It has been voted in by landslide majorities since 1994. In addition to this, their credentials as the vanguard of the anti-apartheid movement is undisputed even by its rivals. So their claim to power is as solid as any in liberal democracies. This has not prevented the ANC from trying to recreate the heritage landscape in its own image. The prevailing ethos of the post-1994 era has been an inclusive state, i.e., it is a state in which embraces everybody, both the beneficiaries and the victims of colonialism and apartheid. The institutions of state reflected this pluralism and inclusivity. This is what is often described internationally as the South African miracle. As a result, we have a situation in which the monuments that celebrated colonial and apartheid heroes exist side by side with newer monuments that chronicle the anti-apartheid struggle. In some cases, institutions that represented oppression were converted into new ones, including what is called Constitution Hill, which was once a prison and now houses the Constitutional Court and a museum. And also we have Robben Island Museum, which where Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners were kept, which is now been converted into a museum. There are other sites dotted around the country. The art historian N. Coombs, historian N. Coombs, argues that this strategy allows for a process of healing in that it not only allows the previously oppressed to feel that the history of oppression is represented, while at the same time enables former oppressors to feel that they have a stake in the new dispensation. Since the Mandela years, the recurring theme in most institutions, including museums, has been reconciliation. What this means is that government officials were, okay, sorry, let me just repeat that. This means that we as government officials are bound to that code through, we are bound to preach this dogma. At the time, a lot of language, at the same time, a lot of the language at the heart of South African heritage management borrows some concept from UNESCO policies, terms such as social cohesion, intangible heritage, symbolic reparations. While many of these policies certainly have a nice ring to them, the issues that they do not specifically address while these terms have a nice ring to them, the issue is that they do not specifically address the relationship between oppressor and oppressed, and seem to operate in an ideal world. But South Africa is and has been polarized along racial lines. It has been, the racial issue has not been adequately dealt with by the new government. At the same time, the terms in which the guiding ethos need to follow the imperatives of the developmental states. Thus, museum work is seen less as belonging to knowledge production, but rather to developmental framework. Of course, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but the developmentalism in South Africa always borrows heavily from policies such as the UN Millennium Development Goals, which are again doomed to fail if they do not take into account the history of dispossession, and because they are dependent on the application of neoliberal understanding of social development and human development. This is where my sense of bureaucratization of memory emanates from. So what does bureaucratization entail? I've delineated a few examples of this. The first one being the professionalization of heritage. Historians, artists, curators, archivists, architects have become the experts which government and private institutions have relied on in order to narrate the history of the anti-apartheid struggle. So everything is left to the professionals, who are, by most accounts, the privileged sectors of society, specifically because they have had access to institutions of higher learning and access to cultural institutions, which most of the dispossessed and uneducated majority cannot access. So effectively what this means is that it's the privileged strata of society that is able to narrate this anti-apartheid narrative. The second is the notion of South African exceptionalism. So for instance, what the terms that we tend to use is anti-apartheid instead of anti-colonial. And it is important to remember in this context that Up until 1961, South Africa was a British colony, and in fact, the anti-apartheid, or what is called the anti-apartheid movement, is born at a time when it is actually an anti-colonial movement, and apartheid only becomes effective in the 1950s. And also we use terms such as post-apartheid instead of post-colonial. And what that does also is that it tends to separate the South Africa from other post-colonial struggles. It tends to see apartheid as an exception to colonialism, but also sees South Africa as an exception to other African countries, and certainly to other countries, whether it's South America or the East. But also this narrative of South African exceptionalism tends to foreground or tends to blackmail people out of demanding certain reparations, with the threat that if you make these demands, then South Africa is going to go the same way as other African countries. So that it becomes a silencing mechanism against issues of social justice. And then there's also the institutionalization of commemoration. And in this case, I will use the example of the commemorations of the Soweto uprising, which happened in 1976. Previous to 1994, these commemorations were held at a church called the Regina Mundi in Soweto, and were typically interdenominational, even though they were held in the Catholic Church, and multi-political, even though within those commemorations there were contestations around among other things, the authorship of the Soweto uprising, and also which political formation was the vanguard of the anti-apartheid movement. And all of this has been documented quite well by Dr. Ali Hlongwane, who was once chief curator for the institution that I now work for. In the post-1994 era, the means of commemoration, prior to 1994, the means of commemoration also took artistic forms such as theater, production of t-shirts, posters, songs, and poetry. The intervention of the post-1994 state meant that political elite were prioritized in commemoration and became consistent with the dramaturgy of power and national symbols. The discourse of nation building became the overriding ethos. The question then becomes, what do you do with divisive memories? So the commemorations have become very much a thing of the state, and as some political formations say it has become a stage for the ANC to promote itself. The ANC, of course, being the ruling party, and the promotion of the ANC's own version of the liberation struggle to the exclusion of other contributors to the downfall of apartheid. Part of the means through which the bureaucratization happens is through the use of memory for tourism. And of course, a lot of has been written about dark tourism. And also the claims to social justice have been diverted into an expression of economic opportunity. So when people say that they need water, they need sanitation, they need houses, the diversionary tactic is that, no, what you need is to have businesses, and that way you can then make a living for yourself, and then you can pay for all of these services. So museums and other sites of memory are being used as sites in which people can then supposedly, because of the tourist industry, create jobs. And then there's also the management of discontent, which I again refer to, which again relates to the commodification of memory. But also there are processes through which demands, for instance, for reparations and for compensation for the crimes of apartheid are managed through red tape and bureaucratic processes. So, for instance, in the TRC process, which happened in the 90s, one had to make testimonies and submissions to say that you deserve compensation, but also in the present era, and there was an incident a few years ago when one of the members of the families that lost their loved ones in the 1976 uprising were told that the processes of compensation had been concluded when the TRC was finished, so you cannot get compensation after the period. So these kinds of laws and processes tend to frustrate the process of seeking compensation. But then there is also just the management of museums, which, as Ahmed pointed out, there is this separate spaces of where of management and decision making happen, and the public spaces where the narration happens, and the processes which dictate what gets seen and how things are narrated are often opaque, and public does not have access to that form of knowledge. And in fact, there is a kind of a de facto gag on municipal employees not to speak to the media without permission. So it's not that they are not allowed to speak to the media, but they can't speak to the media without permission. So it has, whatever you say has to go through a vetting process before you can say what you need to say. So all of these processes do not necessarily cut off the free expression of what you need to say, because after all, the freedom of speech is enshrined in the Constitution, but it just frustrates the process of doing so. Okay, so I'm just basically what I'm saying, that there's this kind of managerial, almost professionalization techniques that make the processes of the state supersede issues of social justice and social repressions. Now I'm going to really very quickly go through why I find particularly this decolonial moment an interesting one, and one that potentially holds some promise for museums in general, but also for the way in which social justice can be achieved, and the role of museums within the struggle for social justice. I must preface my this with an admission that, for the most part, as far as I've observed at least, there hasn't been any serious attempt by museums and universities as the primary sites of knowledge production in where cultural issues are concerned and heritage is concerned. There hasn't been any serious attempt to transform. So many of the institutions, for instance, that we now sit with were institutions that existed under apartheid. I used to work for an institution called the Johannesburg Art Gallery, and even though some of the staff have changed, and even though some of the programs have changed, the institutional culture has not changed. And this is where I'm fully in support of Ahmed here, because even though the notion of the intervener, he speaks of it as a kind of outsider in kind of approach. Even within themselves, institutions have got to effect transformation. So, for instance, a very simple example is that in the institution that I used to work for, the Johannesburg Art Gallery, the majority of the staff is black, but they are in the bottom half of the division. The top management is exclusively white. So the demands of the black staff to get into those kinds of positions, it's not that they are barred from them, but there's just it's a glass ceiling kind of scenario. So even to protest this outside of the institution is seen as insubordination, and there are many examples which I could quote that demonstrates this. Some of them which happened to me personally, and I'm going to talk about that probably during the question and answer session. But let me quickly move through the issue of the decolonial moment. Now, there are many things that I will not mention here, which are very important to this discussion. Okay, but anyway, the language of protest never really quite left South Africa, even in the post-1994 movement. But in terms of the expression of political will, there have been, broadly speaking, two forms. One has prioritized the language of electoral and judicial processes, which are detected by a number of rituals and a certain type of language. It is governed by decorum. There's a deference to the judiciary and institutions such as what was called the Chapter 9 institutions, which include the Equality, the Human Rights Foundation, and other such institutions. But also includes a language which is sanitized of the visceral elements of what communities might be experiencing. And this has also been largely the language which has been used in museums, in universities, and in business. There is also another set of interests, of course, that have also played a role in the kind of sanitization of language, even in language which claims to be anti-establishment. And these have included a number of foreign funding agencies, which includes institutions such as the Goethe Institute, the French Cultural Institute, and others. These have exerted what I would call a kind of benevolent pressure on artistic production, curatorial choices, and discourses. All of this exists within the language of constitutionalism, and that the idea that whatever ails society can be solved through the exercise of instruments provided for by the Constitution. This form of political speech, discontent is muted and sanitized, and languages outside of this have been ignored or rendered illegitimate by the establishment. On the other hand, there is a recurring language of protest, which is being used largely by trade unions, students, and various communities in what is often called service delivery protests. And it has acquired increasingly more militant forms of expression. There has been a rejection of business as usual. And these protests have drawn on previous forms of protest, some older, some newer, and so for instance there has been a re-articulation of freedom songs that were sung in the anti-apartheid struggle days and have been appropriated to new meanings in the present era. Some of the protests, for instance, against certain symbols of colonialism, like the Rhodes statue which stood at the University of Cape Town campus. Somebody called Gule poured excrement on the statue following previous protests by a group of people who were dubbed by the press as the poo fighters because they used excrement to register their unhappiness about the conditions of sanitations in some of the cultures in Cape Town. And more recently, there has been burning of buildings in university campuses and the burning of paintings which were seen as colonial paintings. The politics of disruption and destruction have been at the forefront in recent months, and the idea that everything must fall. And here there lies in the greatest kind of bone of contention between the older generation of struggle fighters and the newer generation, the younger generation of students, because this notion that everything must fall also suggests that their legacy has been a betrayal of the, oh dear, I just ran out of, my computer just went off. But anyway, no, it's not that type of, but anyway, I'm about to finish, yeah. Oh, great, thank you. So this decolonial movement has drawn quite heavily, specifically because of this betrayal that students feel towards the government, the post-1994 government, which among other things has tended to cut off the language of race and reparations from national discourse. But also the older generation of struggle veterans, because the students argue that they, instead of overturning the structural racism that exists in the country, they've merely sought to sanitize it and to assimilate into the structure rather than to actually effect a radical change. And so one of the many things that the students have done is that they've rejected, for instance, the language of non-racialism in favor of the language of anti-racism. And other manifestations have been the renaming of buildings and institutions. So, for instance, the certain buildings in the University of Cape Town have been named Azania House, and in Johannesburg at the University of the Witwatersrand, the main hall or the main kind of administrative building, which was called Senate House, has been renamed Solomon Mahlangu House. And these are all of course not official names, but these are just ways in which students have sought to regain symbolic power over these institutions. And along with that, there has been a kind of revival of certain historical figures from the dustbin of history, including people such as Steve Biko, Thomas Sankara, and Frans Fanon. And these have provided to the students a new way of articulating what they regard as a historical injury and their current struggles. So the decolonial movement is not just about colonial figures and imagery, and it's not only about education or what is called insourcing, and I'll explain what insourcing is for those who might not know it. And it's not just about language, and it's not only about whether or not students have access to residencies, but even though all of these are very important issues within the struggle, but what I feel is that these movements are about changing the nature of politics itself. And included in that is a kind of a disrespect of political figures. So Mandela, who is seen internationally as a symbol of liberation, has been increasingly questioned for the compromises that he and others made in the run-up to 1994, and certainly. Authorities, whether they be political authorities or authorities within the university, have been made to humble themselves, in the sense that, for instance, one of the main leaders in the African National Congress's name is Gwede Mantashe. When the students marched to the Luthuli House, which is the headquarters of the ANC, instead of allowing him to address them or on a podium, they forced him to come down from the podium so that he could address them at the same level, a physical level. And also they tried to get him to sit down, but then he refused, so they allowed that to happen. But there is also the kind of disruption of the tendency to defer authority to age. So a lot of people, for instance, were very angry because the students who are much younger were telling this older person to come down to their level, and a lot of people are unhappy about that. But there is this kind of anti-ageism slant to this decolonial movement as well. Okay, so I'm just going to jump now to the end. The central disjuncture between the response of the government and universities on the one side and the students on the other side has been the formal structures, is that the formal structures have demanded that they cannot negotiate with the mob, and they can't deal with student, and that they want to deal with student representative councils or SRCs that have been elected and are formal part of the university structures. And they've insisted that the SRCs do have representation within university councils, but the students have refused to operate through elected leaders. Because these movements, the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the Fees Must Fall movement, have insisted on a non-hierarchical structure, which is diffuse and ever evolving, and even the set of demands is constantly evolving. The question, of course, now is where is this all leading us? And it is unclear at the moment that there is a particular direction, but what is, for me at least, clear is that there can be no return to a state of normality. But also there is, from what I've seen again, is that the institutional culture, whether you're talking about museums or universities, there is no acknowledgement that the terms of reference for whatever change is going to take place is no longer in the hands of these institutions which have traditionally been in control of knowledge production, that they do no longer have control over this, and that they either need to adapt or be destroyed in the process. Okay, that's
Okay.
thank you.
So we have to